Now you talk about terror. What about for me? I've been terrorized all my day. All my day.
In the fall of 1980, I was a second-year student at Harvard Divinity School. I intended, like my father, to become a Presbyterian minister. But I was by nature a writer and a news junkie who devoured at least 2 newspapers a day and had already published freelance articles in papers such as the Christian Science Monitor. I could not, however, reconcile the social activism of my father, who was involved in the Vietnam anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, with the supposed neutrality and objectivity demanded by American journalism. It was then that I met Robert Cox, the former editor of the Buenos Aires Herald, who was a Nieman Fellow for the year at Harvard. Bob had reported on the crimes of the dirty war in Argentina, which saw some 30,000 Argentines disappeared by military death squads in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The victims were held in secret prisons, savagely tortured and murdered. Many families to this day do not know the fate of their sons, daughters, siblings, and spouses. Bob received frequent death threats in a climate where some 60 Argentine journalists were also kidnapped by the military and disappeared. He fatally accepted that he too would be killed, which he said gave him a strange kind of comfort, and continued to doggedly persist in making public the names of those who had disappeared and the anguish of their families. In his example, I saw that journalism did not have to be divorced from morality, that while the truth was always paramount and should never be twisted to serve one side or another, we have an obligation as journalists to give a voice to the vulnerable, especially those who are being silenced and persecuted by the powerful. I took a leave from Divinity School to study Spanish at the language school run by the Marinol Society in Bolivia and report on the heinous dictatorships in Latin America. I covered the Falkland War from Buenos Aires for NPR and then, after returning to get my degree from Harvard, left for El Salvador, where I would spend the next 5 years reporting on the conflicts in Central America. The last piece of sage advice Bob gave me before I left for Bolivia was to take with me the 4 volumes of George Orwell's collected essays, journalism, and letters, which became my secular Bible. A new film, Messenger on a White Horse, available on Amazon, documents Bob and his wife Maud's heroic stand in Argentina. Joining me to discuss his experiences in Argentina, the documentary, and what it means to be a reporter is Bob Cox. So just before we begin, I can't say enough how important you were for me and a kind of model that I carried with me throughout the next 20 years that I was overseas. And not just me, Stephen Kinzer and all sorts of other reporters feel the same way. You really held up for us what it means to be a reporter, especially in societies where there is tremendous amounts of oppression. I want to begin with Andrew Graham Yule's very fine book, State of Fear. He also worked with you at the Buenos Aires Herald, and it chronicles that period up to the 1976 coup when the military took over, because I think it's an important component to understanding what came next. Can you describe that climate that led up to the coup?
Well, you had so much violence every day that with Andrew, and nobody was taking any notice of, and we decided to just publish a list of people being murdered by one side or another in a kind of underground war that was going on prior to the actual coup itself. And it was just unbelievable because there was so much violence. And the newspapers, they did 2 strange things anyway. Later on, it was a different thing. But at that time, they'd hide it all away until the moment came when, working with the military, the press went in and started to emphasize the violence that was coming from the left, when there was violence from the left and the right. it became almost unlivable at that time. So people were prepared for anything. And as Argentina had a tradition of military coups, which were, in those days, you talked about a soft coup and a hard coup. And most of Argentina's coups had been soft coups. The military came in, painted things a bit and cleaned things up and called elections. And so much the same kind of thing was expected this time.
Yeah, you had underground groups, the Montoneros, and these were left-wing radical groups, and constant kidnappings. When that coup took place in 1976, the Army Chief of Staff Videla under Isabel Perón takes power. And in the documentary, it shows that even the Buenos Aires Herald, even people like you, saw the coup as a kind of relief.
Yeah, we thought that at least they would stop the killing. They'd stop the killing, which was, going on both sides, that they would just restore law and that they would operate within the law, bring the people responsible for the violence to justice. That's what we really prayed for, quite honestly prayed for.
How long did it take you to realize that this was not what was taking place, that the military was now aggressively kidnapping and disappearing? And I should say that very few of the some 30,000 victims, I think 1,000 or something, have been identified. Many of them were taken in what they call death flights. They were drugged and dropped into the ocean. And I'll let you tell the story about the crematorium, you and Maud. I mean, it's an amazing story. But just, did you realize gradually, or talk about that process?
Well, to begin with, we clearly got an idea that things were not going to be the way we hoped they would be, because the first thing that happened was that we were instructed by the military, having taken over, that we were not allowed to report any acts of violence, any disappearances, or any without official backing. And so that was the first indication. And then it was known, but you didn't know quite what was happening. And then with Andrew Graham Ewell's, it happened. Andrew got a letter from an old couple who knew his father, and they tried to tell him that something terrible had happened, but they couldn't quite explain it. The reason they called him was because they published a death notice in the newspaper, a funeral notice, and there was a slight mistake in it, and they wanted to correct that. And realizing what was happening, we went out to see them. So that was the first, and there the confirmation was unbelievable, because what we discovered is that their son-in-law who was running a chemical laboratory there, who was taken away, one quite correctly in a way to begin with, and he was found later on more dead than alive, having been tortured so badly. And then we heard the story, and we discovered that later I discovered that particular place, they had just taken people quite without, just on the day of the coup, they stopped everybody in the street and asked them for their papers and identity cards, and just took people away en masse. And it was later on that I heard that, in fact, what had happened is that they then routinely tortured everybody. And when people are tortured, they'll say anything at all. I'm encapsulating a bit, because I became very close friends with the secretary of the Papal Nuncio, an Irish priest, Kevin Mullen, who I knew as Kevin, Monsignor Mullen. And he had called me one day later on and said, "Bob, come, you must come quickly. I must tell you about this." This man came into me and said, "I want to confess to you that when I was taken away, they tortured me, and they said, 'Dame 10 nombres de la orga,' which was the slang to say, give us 10 names of people in the guerrilla organization. And he thought, what do I do? We've got to stop this. And he gave 10 names of the most respectable people he could think of, thinking that nobody would think that they could possibly be a member of a terrorist organization or guerrilla organization. And they all disappeared, he said. It was all around you at that time, but you couldn't quite be certain of it. But I don't know what to say exactly, but one had to go on producing a newspaper. And we decided, both Andrew and I, that we found a way of asking for habeas corpus, which gave us some kind of cover. It wasn't really, and we stopped doing it later on. But we decided we just had to report what was happening, because fairly early on, too, we discovered that journalism can save lives. We could save lives if we could quickly get something into the newspaper that would make the military halt or stop. So we would, quite quickly, people were coming to us. We didn't have to go out anymore. As I was going out beforehand to understand what was quite exactly going on in the incident that you mentioned, where with Maud, we heard that they were burning bodies in the crematorium at midnight, from midnight onwards in the nighttime. And we went out and saw the smoke coming from the chimneys of the crematorium. And it was exactly what was happening.
How long did it take you to realize how extensive the torture centers, because it was quite a vast apparatus. I think, what is it, upwards of 300 clandestine centers. And we're talking about, and of course they were disappearing, not left-wing guerrillas. They were labor leaders, student activists, journalists, as I mentioned. How long did it take you to realize how extensive it was?
How long? I suppose. The thing is, when I look back now and check up, I found that we did report very early on, much earlier on than I had thought. But we could only report what we could actually confirm, because I was always worried that the military would try and entrap us in some way or other by coming with some phony story that would then show us up. But I think this is what remains with me all the time. It was so obvious what was happening, but people managed not to see it. I think that is what worries me so much. And I found myself haunted too by Hannah Arendt, who said there were so few people who cared in Germany. In this case, there were so few people who were honest enough to see what was happening. Now, it was not easy. And early on, I realized that when people see something, being somebody dragged away and thrown into a car, and then the car screams off, and they have machine guns out of the way, and they threaten everybody on the way to this unknown place. And somebody sees that, to begin with, they expect to see something in the newspaper or on television the next day, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing. And that's what happened. And the military controlled television, radio, but there were some independent, and the major newspapers were free. They could do what they want. They could have made a decision at the very beginning, as we made a decision, that we've got to somehow tell our readers what's going on. And they didn't. They decided that, they worked with the military. That's what it amounted to.
Well, the Buenos Aires Herald, which was an English language paper, although there is a large English-speaking community in Argentina. I think the number is about 100,000, if I remember correctly. But you were alone. And you did publish your editorials in Spanish in the documentary. Somebody goes to change a tire or something in the garage, and there is one of your editorials in Spanish up on the wall. But you took on this outsized importance for, and especially the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, these courageous mothers who protested because their children had been disappeared. You were alone, largely doing this, and I'm wondering if that experience at that time made you rethink your role as a reporter or as a journalist.
Well, what I discovered early on is that we could save lives, that journalism can save lives. Made me realize how important journalism is. Now, these were very special circumstances, and I did have a lot of support to begin with. It was underground support, but there were some heroes of that time. Tex Harris, an American diplomat, who was sent down to watch the military regime because at that time they were trying to come up with a nuclear weapon, and that was his job. And when he came down, he was horrified by what he saw. He went to Plaza de Mayo one day and handed out his card to all the mothers that he met there and said, come to my office and tell me. He opened the doors of the embassy, I suppose because he was such a fine man that there was certainly, he eventually was taken off and his career could have absolutely ended. But he was the first one to take down names and take down the names of the missing. And so he had something like 10,000 names of disappeared people on card indexes in his office, helped by a woman, German woman, actually, of German extraction.
Well, this was under the Carter administration where there was some sympathy with Pat Darien in charge of human rights.
Exactly.
And then, of course, you shifted to Reagan. And that's when Tex Harris, I think, was shuttled off to AID or something. I just have
a lot of pressure before then. It was actually before then, but pressure from business interests in the US who wanted to go on selling arms to Argentina.
I just have to say, Tex Harris saved my career. You probably don't know that.
I didn't know that.
He was moved to AID and a man of course, great moral probity and courage. And there was a war in the Reagan administration against reporters who were covering and writing about the atrocities committed by the military in El Salvador. And they framed me, accusing me of falsifying a story, and did a pretty good job of convincing, I was writing for the Christian Science Monitor at the time, the editors that story was falsified. And suddenly the foreign editor got a call from a guy named Tex Harris. And he explained who he was, and he said, I want to tell you everything your reporter wrote is true. And this is a campaign to crush him and stop his reporting. And it absolutely saved my career. I was a young freelance journalist.
Tex was a magnificent human being. He was a glorious person, absolutely wonderful. And, somebody like him, well, we knew, of course, he would talk to the CIA, he'd talk to the FBI guy. So he knew pretty well everything. The CIA and FBI were in touch with the military. And so, he never gave me those kind of details. But what we did is work together when we could see that there was somebody that we could possibly save by, if we could get something into the newspaper about them, and give them some kind of foreign, say they would, something that has to be truthful, obviously, but say they had studied at Harvard or whatever. And so that would, and it could be anything anyway, but the idea was to alert the diplomats of the democratic countries who would then start asking the military about them. And that would make the military worried about things. And Tex was just magnificent at that time.
You say you realized you had to go to diplomatic parties, which you hated, but those kinds of connections, for the reasons you just pointed out, were vital.
Very vital, because we could, I could interest them in these cases. And what has been forgotten now is there's a tendency in Argentina to make the guerrillas sound heroic, and to forget and to argue that all the missing were heroic guerrillas, and they weren't. There were lots and lots of innocent people picked up. People were taken away because their name appeared in the address book. At that time, you had address books, the address book of somebody who was possibly involved. We will never know that because the military decided they were not interested in finding out who could be guilty of some kind of crime or not. They were just interested in disposing of people
There's a
they thought suspicious.
heavy cost that you, Maud, ultimately your children pay. Talk about the kind of pressure they put you under.
I think I ignored it, really. They used to follow me all the time. And I used to play it out as if it was a Hitchcock film, because I insisted on just living a normal life. I think it's probably very risky when I look back on it, but I think it might have helped me because I think they couldn't understand who I was and why I was. When I would go to work, I would go on the bus and the guy would follow me, and there'd be a fellow reading a newspaper, and he'd drop his newspaper and jump on the bus if I got on the bus a bit early. All kinds of things happened. They one day they unscrewed they loosened all the bolts on the front wheel of a car. Fortunately, we were coming back from the country where I was with all the children. The car was packed with all our kids, and we suddenly saw the wheel rolling away in front of us. These were just odd things that happened. Telephone would ring, and we got used to those kind of things. All those, they were constant. And we had a game that we used to play. They used to call up the newspaper, and we'd say we have a time you can phone up with these questions, trying to not to laugh it off because it wasn't a sort of gallows humor or anything like that, but to keep sanity, really.
And yet there was a realization. I think you, in the documentary, they talk about one reporter who carried a razor. You yourself said that you came to accept that you would probably die, but you didn't want to be tortured.
Yeah. With Jim Nielsen, who wrote editorials with me, great person. And fortunately, this is something that I think is important. He was of the right. I've given up even deciding with myself whether I'm right, left. I don't think I'm any of those things. And I always thought journalists shouldn't be any of those things. They shouldn't be right, left. They should just try and be outside politics in that way. And he said to me one day, "Well, Bo, I'm not going to let them take me." And he showed me he had this cutthroat razor, this old-fashioned cutthroat razor, which I suppose he thought he'd do so much damage they'd have to kill him. I had all kinds of ruses that I thought I would carry out. I would get into an elevator and stop the elevator between floors. I mean, I wasn't foolish in that way, but I did decide that it was a bit like, I said to myself, well, I don't even know whether I really did think this, or not, but it's something that I gave myself to carry on. I said to myself, well, the first time you're on an airplane, you're frightened. The second time, it's the same. What you need to do is, and I decided that, and the way to get over it, any kind of fear you have of flying, I did suggest this to people, but nobody picked me up on it, is to say to yourself, this flight that I'm going to go on is going to crash. Knowing that it's going to crash, you don't worry about it anymore. So essentially, that's what I did every day. I expected, and every day that went by, it was a victory. It was great, until they went after my kids and my wife. Well, I mean, they tried to kidnap her, and God knows they were madness. That was a time of enormous madness, and I still have not been able to put it into a frame that makes any sense. The madness started unnecessarily, I think, absolutely unnecessarily. The situation in Argentina could have been worked out. But it's a complicated country.
Well, it reverberates today. I want to talk about your childhood. It is brought up in the film. You were in London during the Blitz. Many of the children in London were shipped out into the country, but somehow you managed to stay behind. And it draws parallels between living in London during the Blitz, I guess you were 7 or 8 or something, and that experience in Argentina. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. A friend of mine once said to me he had a good war. It was Andrew Graham Ewell. He said he had a good war in Argentina because he went there to cover when the Argentine military made the big mistake of invading the Falkland Islands, as the British call it, Malvinas, as the Argentine called it. He had a good war. As a child, we were happy. We were a happy band, and the people were too. And I came across something of that in Argentina because suddenly we got supported. The newspaper, very small. I mean, we could have been swatted like a fly to begin with. And then we became important, and people would read the newspaper just to know something of what was going on. And so we suddenly got people advertising who never advertised before. And we saw the, in a way, traditional advertisers of the newspaper, the multinational companies, withdrew their advertising from us. And so with not quite the same, because we did feel very alone, we'd see people who were friends of ours and they'd cross to the other side of the street. I've heard this so many times now, I realize that it must be universal. You know, if you become a suspicious person in some way, and I became a suspicious person because by that time I was supposed to be a communist to begin with. They had me down as an imperialist. Fortunately, the Navy man who was a murderer, an unbelievably evil man, believed that I must be CIA and actually said to the American ambassador, Bob Hill told me later on, he said, and when Massera said to me, I know he's CIA, Bob Hill said, I put an expression onto my face as if to say, it might be true. And that might have helped in a way. That might have helped.
I want to talk, you go back, they have kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's a very poignant moment in the film where you break down, you can't speak. Can you talk about what it was like to return to Argentina and speak about these crimes, this state terror that you covered?
You know, what I keep going back to is this business that people did not care, that they in a way knew. They didn't know everything. It wasn't written down there, or they couldn't read it or see it. But everybody knew in a way what was happening. And I remember meeting a Brazilian diplomat and talking, as I did to everybody that I met, about what was going on in Argentina. And he sort of dismissed it and said, but what I don't understand is the children, what they did when they picked up any young woman, and some of them were pregnant, and if they were pregnant, they allowed them to have their children in the most appalling conditions. And then when the child was born, they killed the mother, the young mother. And the grandmothers of Las Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo were formed of these women looking for their grandchildren. That, I think, is the most horrific side of it. But the other thing is the Nazism. These people were, in a way, Nazis over again. When you went into I was lucky that I went to one of the so-called legal jails, not the clandestine prisons. And when you enter that after being stripped, you see in front of you, covering a huge wall, enormous wall, a huge swastika, and underneath it, Nazi nationalism. And they used to play Hitler's speeches to cover the sounds of people being tortured. And as I got to know more of the military, they more and more, I mean, they boasted. They thought that they were leading the Third World War against international communism. They also had plans to invade Chile, eventually Brazil. I mean, lunacy got into their heads. They hadn't fought a war for 100 years until then. And then the war that they did fight, this dirty war, gave them delusions of grandeur for a while. But you can't understand how they could be like that, because they should be so ashamed of themselves. And some of them were. One day, the colonel, who I got to know quite well, because I used to go to the government house because they would complain about the stories that we were writing. And I said, look, I'm not interested. I just let these people appear. I won't publish a word about it. It's fine. I'll give you a list of these people who I know you've got. And so tell us where they are and, what's going to happen to them. And that's fine. There won't be anything else. And then he said to me, but did you know, he said, we call them our centurions. These are these poor guys who have to go out and do these terrible things. And when they go back, he said, they can't kiss their wives and they can't touch their children. He honestly expected me to be sympathetic to him, not realizing, of course, that echoes exactly what the SS were told. They were told, you're doing glorious things, but you can never tell anybody about it.
Great. We're going to stop there, Bob. I want to thank the Real News Network and its production team, Cameron Granadino, Adam Coley, Dwayne Gladden, and Kayla Rivera. You can find me at chrishedges.substack.com.